Welcome back to another episode of the Gary Hamel series. We're covering that bad boy back there leading the revolution. I thought we'd be way more into the book by now, and then I went and read chapter 3. We're only on chapter 3, and Gary was an early proponent of what we know now well as business model generation. Back then, he called it business concept innovation. And Gary, you touched on it the last day, but I'd love to just spend an episode on it and pull out a few of the threads within that chapter. Great examples in there as well. Some that went on to become very, very successful, some that built on early success, and some that faded away. But I'd love you to introduce this concept.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to. I guess now it's quite familiar to most people, but certainly not at the time. Historically, we typically thought about innovation in terms of new products and new services. It was a new financial derivative or, a new digital device or a new grocery product and so on. And clearly what was happening through the kind of dot-com revolution and beyond is that entrepreneurs, newcomers were reconceiving entire business systems, even ecosystems, and you had to take a kind of more comprehensive view of innovation and recognize that when you think about a business model, it's a change in value proposition, it's a change in the competencies that may be underlying that business, it's a change in how you go to market, it's a change in the partnership structures that you use. And in most organizations at the time, and maybe still now, they weren't really organized to think about innovation in that way. They typically, most companies have some kind of product development function that is, there to take on the next product iteration, but they weren't stepping back and thinking about the fact that you may have to challenge or rethink every aspect of the business model. So I think that was a relatively new thought at the time, less so now for sure, but I'm not sure most large companies are much better at innovation at that level. And we can certainly talk about some that are, but I think most still struggle.
There's a little quote here that you might riff on. You talk about limitations of traditional product innovation and that it is often confined by the physical product or the actual service, yet the product is only one of several components that comprise the overall business concept. Thinking in terms of business concepts rather than products significantly extends the potential scope for innovation, you tell us. It may be possible, for example, to build a radically different business concept, even when the product itself is a virtual commodity. This is what Dell Computer, you told us at the time, accomplished in the PC business. Maybe we'll give that as a little example before we go deeper into the concepts of this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, Dell, which I think is still one of the market leaders there, at the time, most PCs were sold to retailers, maybe direct if you were a large company. But of course, Dell's model was to do this all online, to have everything custom built as people ordered it. They had no physical stores, no physical distribution. That allowed them to significantly lower their costs. So that whole direct to consumer model, I think Dell was probably really the first to scale that up in that industry. And that was definitely an example of business concept innovation or business model innovation. And ultimately, everybody followed suit, but it gave Dell a significant lead. And I think for some long time, made it the most profitable, the fastest growing PC company. And you can argue, Apple did the same thing when they built their own retail presence, right? That was a very odd thing to do for a single electronic brand. I don't think it had ever been really done before. And they said, we can build a Genius Bar. We can provide support there. We can help people set up their new products. We can demonstrate the products in the best possible physical environment. We can have staff that really understand the product line and are passionate about it. And of course, most people at the time thought it was a foolish idea. There are many people in the press that like, we all know where to go buy an Apple product. Why the heck do we need like a dedicated place? So that again was an example of looking beyond the product and looking at everything that surrounds it and saying, this is all part of creating something that is unique, that has differentiation, that is a better proposition for the customer. But if you were product centric, you would have never seen that opportunity.
Gary, there's a couple of graphs in the book. There's many, and one that really brings this chapter together. I thought we'd share with our audience, and I'd love you to talk to it. And we'll have a little bit empathy for those people who are just listening to us, which is the majority of how the show is consumed. But this is expanding the innovation horizon, and it's a two by two, and maybe you'll take our audience through it.
You can look at innovation probably if you think of the entire business model. How do we go to market? What's the product bundle? What's the service? What's the infrastructure behind it? You can look at that in two dimensions. One is in any innovation you look at, like how big of a departure is that from the status quo, right? How in a sense radical is it? And I should probably take a moment here, Aiden, to give a definition of innovation because what I find interesting is a lot of companies, there's a lot of talk about innovation. It's a word we use all the time, but very few organizations have actually defined it. And so that makes it very difficult. Different people can use the same word in very different ways. And if you're starting to try to calibrate a new product or whatever it is, and is this really innovative or not? There's not a common way of doing that. So here's my little definition, and which will help set up this discussion. And it's just mine. There may be others that are better, but typically when somebody throws out a new idea, the three questions that I want to ask to judge is it truly radical or not. Number one, to what extent does it reset customer expectations? And so the first time I used PayPal, the first time any of us started to use digital payments was Venmo, Cash, PayPal, whatever it was. That was a pretty big reset, right? Suddenly you could send money anywhere around the world almost instantly. And that's a fairly radical reset compared to using kind of cash. You can imagine other things that are much more incremental. The second question is, does it change the basis for competition? So when Amazon starts selling books and other things online, right, that's just completely different set of skill sets, competencies, and so on that you need to compete in that way. It's not a little better bookstore, a little better retailer. It was like really very different. And then the third question you ask is, does it change industry economics? So particularly on the cost side, often we think of innovation as product services, but very seldom do we think about innovation that dramatically reduces the cost. And yet that's what we saw with Ryanair. It's what we saw with the move to cloud computing, which dramatically reduced the cost of managing IT infrastructure. So does this innovation in some fundamental way change industry economics, not by a little bit, but by a lot? So you can look at any kind of idea and start to score it. You can build your own examples along those continua and start to think about, is this really radical or not? And then the second dimension is, well, how broad does does this affect only one element in your business model, or does it affect many? So that's the little two by two. How radical is it? How broad is it? And of course, the things that are most difficult for incumbents to respond to are the things that are in the upper right hand corner there that are both quite radical and quite broad. Amazon is a classic example there. Interestingly enough, the iPhone is in that same space because it obviously wasn't just a device. It was a whole app store around it, and now millions of apps that change the way we use our devices. And so it was an entire ecosystem. So that kind of innovation that's both broad and radical is obviously quite difficult and comparatively rare. But when you get it right, it is extremely difficult for competitors to follow. First, because in the very fact that it's radical means like it's beyond their understanding. They may not have the skills to do it. It challenges a lot of comfortable preconceptions they have about how that industry should work. And then when it's broad, there's a lot of different elements that have to be orchestrated and come together to do it. So I suppose you might call it like the holy grail of innovation. A company like Tencent, you would put them up there. Hire's done a lot of innovation in that territory in the last few years. Many organizations do it once, very few do it more than once.
There's so many prophecies in the book, Gary. For example, like this whole idea of business model generation or business concept innovation, as you called it. But one of the things you called out, you said, for example, and you were giving out about the state of higher education, third level, and executive education. And you called these cyber B schools, which we know today as MOOCs versus business schools. And he wrote back then, new business models sometimes render old business models obsolete. For example, it's easy to imagine internet based phone calls based on packet switching, largely supplanting phone calls made on dedicated voice circuits. More often, new business models don't destroy old business models, they just siphon off customer demand, slowly deflating the profit potential of the old business model. You then go on to share a case study of one of them, which was Sephora, and you explain how the old way was and then how Sephora challenged the business model. And what I love, Gary, is reading these books where you were ahead of the curve. And I often wonder, did a business person read it and go, I'm actually just going to do that? It's been spelled out for me here. But maybe you'll give us an example of what you saw, the potential you saw in a business like Sephora back then.
I think to your last point there, I think some people did look at that, and I have some experience of companies says, "Yeah, let's go try this." I think probably more often they said, "WTF?" Like this just looks too hard, too difficult. Like, nah, let's not try it. Let's not think like this. Yeah, I mean, Sephora, and of course, their business model has changed a lot over time. But at the time I was writing this, if people remember, if you and not that I spent a lot of time in the cosmetics department, but if you went into any kind of high end department store, they had all those cosmetics laid out, and they were laid out by brand. So whatever they were, Clinique and Estee Lauder and Bobby Brown and whatever, and each brand and Chanel, they had their whatever, their lipsticks and makeup and eyeshadow and so on. And at least initially, what Sephora had done was say, gee, if you want any one of these products, why should you have to go from counter to counter and brand to brand? Like, let's just give you a selection of whatever you're looking for and you pick the best one. Well, I think they probably, and you're going to have to check this. I think they got a lot of pushback, as you might understand, because the brands were very keen to pull you into their little kind of product family, as it were. But Sephora brought all that together. They made it much easier to find things. And yeah, I think they're still reasonably successful. Other examples I laid out have yet to come to fruition. Certainly, the idea of a truly global online business school, there are bits and pieces of that, but we haven't really seen that yet. But I do think one of the important points there, Aiden, is being able to look at a business model and disintegrate it, pull it apart, and say, like, does this still make sense? Or is there a way to put this together in a different? I've spent most of my life as a business school professor, but honestly, the things about it that are just ludicrous. The idea that you would have Rita McGrath or Michael Porter or whoever these great teachers have been, that you'd have them in a classroom, like standing in front of 60, 80, 100 people. Like that's a terrible distribution channel for what they're capable of, right? Why wouldn't you give them a much bigger audience? And then you can pay them like the superstars they are and have local assessments so you can tell whether the students are actually grasping this material or not. And so you start to think about, all right, well, we want to create a degree, but how do you pull that apart? Right. And maybe in the end, the entity that testifies to what you've learned that grasps the degree is not the entity that pulls together all this content and pays the teachers. And so I think it's important to be able to deconstruct something that looks like it's a whole, and you just assume that's how it all has to work together and pull it apart and say, what does this still make sense? Is there a better way of doing this particular part of that business model? So, and if you don't do that, right, if you're not thinking about that systematically, creatively, somebody else will for sure.
One of the things I'm so keen on with this show and the mission of it is, like you said, sometimes people, organizations just don't have that knowledge. They're good at what they do, but it's maybe a tacit knowledge. And when you learn work like yours, you learn work like on the shelves behind me, it gives you these different lenses to see the different models in place. And it's only through that education that actually you can deconstruct the model. And the reason I'm saying that is one of the biggest enemies of innovation, I'm sure you see it all the time, is executive time, is actually getting them to step outside the building and learn and take a step back and absorb this knowledge rather than just reading one of your HBO articles and thinking, I got it.
Very few of us probably change our beliefs or challenge our assumptions just based on something we've read. We really have to have a first person experience with that, either as a consumer or you're out there talking to an entrepreneur, but you move that understanding from kind of head to viscera and it's real to you go like, okay, this is really happening and we got to take this thing seriously. But if it's data on a slide or it's an article, as I said in our last conversation, leaders are really good at dismissing things that they don't agree with. And we do it all the time. One of the examples that I used for a few years, and it's still like amazing to me, but one of the big US television networks, NBC Universal, they had a senior executive who's responsible for media futures. That's this person's job, is to understand how the media landscape is changing. And in 2016, he was talking to a big group of their advertisers on the future media and said, this is like a direct quote. He said, there's too little content on Netflix to matter, and YouTube is a sidebar. And at that time, younger, 18 to 35, they were consuming two-thirds of their media through streaming. And this guy is standing up in front of their clients and saying, it doesn't matter. It's just like, okay, that makes you comfortable to like say that. That's a lovely illusion in which to live if your business is traditional media, but you are misleading all of these people. And so there's nothing more dangerous than an untested assumption or an unexamined assumption or an invisible assumption, right, that you might have. I had another similar experience, and perhaps I relayed this before, but I got up one morning, like at 2 in the morning in California, to be part of a management meeting at the London Business School with a former dean on the topic is what do we do about digital as a school and how fast do we go and what do we do? And I said, this is a great opportunity for us to disconnect the brand of the London Business School from a physical place. And we got to be super creative and thinking about how do we do this globally and so on. And maybe even it's not just our faculty. We take any smart people out there in the world that would like to be part of this community. And I said, students are simply not going to care very much whether it's a physical experience or not. Well, the dean really pushed back on me and he said, no, no, Gary, like there's just something magical about having somebody here. It's not the same thing doing it remotely and so on. And I didn't really push back, but I said, fine. Well, as soon as I was done, somebody else that was in the meeting called me that was there physically. Said, Gary, it's very interesting. As soon as you were done, the dean said, wow, it was just like Gary was here in person. I said, yeah, that was my point. So you got to be super, super careful of what you assume. And I've had that experience over and over again. And I could give you like dozens of examples. And I think I was the first to say this. And I don't know if anybody yet would give you this same perspective, but it's a deep, deep truth for me that if you care about innovation at all, if you're interested in innovating, the starting point before you do anything else has to be to go through very carefully what are the things I believe about who the customer is, what their motivations are, how we reach them, our cost structure, every aspect of our business. What are the assumptions that I have, and how many of these physics that they simply cannot be challenged, their gravity, and how much of these are just assumptions and habits that we built up? And the dilemma is if you do not start there, then whatever other work you're doing on innovation is likely to be within the bounds of that conventional thinking. And you never know what's outside the bounds. So I've always argued that the first step in any process of innovation, and you have to do it systematically and thoughtfully, it's not a simple exercise, is to deconstruct every assumption, every belief that you have, and then ask, like, can you imagine an alternative? Does the world really have to be this way? Often, when in my consulting career, when I've been inside of organizations, I'll have a senior manager say to me, Gary, let me tell you how our industry works. And of course, that's always important. I want to understand how does it work. But whenever somebody says, let me tell you how our industry works, I always am tempted to say, for now, or as far as you know, or until it doesn't, right? But like for them, that is the way the world works. And all right, well, it's one way, but it's not the way.
I'm actually going to jump right to the end of my notes because I usually finish the show with a nice quote that I have from the book, but you've teed me up for this one beautifully. And at the end of the book, you say, many of the choices that define your company's business model were made years ago. Those choices were shaped by the logic of another age. In the fading glow of success, they may seem like inevitabilities, but they're not. It is your job to turn those inevitabilities back into choices, and you do this by subjecting each element of the existing business model to fresh scrutiny. What are the alternatives? Does this choice still have merit? How would a company free of our prejudice tackle this? And it's only in decomposing the existing business model that you can create degrees of freedom where tradition reigns. Beautifully written. You had captured this there, and it was my parting quote, and you absolutely nailed it there as well. So that belief you had then, you still have today. But my point in even sharing that is so few senior execs actually take that step back because it's almost like they're not rewarded for it, or they feel that it's an unnecessary step, or perhaps a couple of the senior team may feel they know this, but they don't actually get it all out in the table to get everybody onto the same page.
I think Aiden is part of a broader kind of problem, if you like, and that is that most leaders are promoted and see their job as running what is, not inventing what could be. And that's fine. The business as it is generating income, it pays everybody's salaries, it rewards investors, and so on. And there are many other kind of management thinkers who've talked about this. But innovation is almost always a sideshow, right? It happens despite the system, it happens at the edges, it happens in isolated units, departments, and so on. And I have no doubt that is a very small percentage of senior executive time, super small percentage. And if you take the senior team, most of them are not mentoring new ideas inside the organization. They are not ensuring that those ideas come to the fore. They are not accountable for clear metrics around innovation. How many ideas of what quality? How quickly are they progressing? How much of my time am I spending helping to mentor nonlinear disruptive ideas? It's just not built into the institutional fabric, the workflows, the budgets, the systems, and so on. And it's amazing that's the case. One of my favorite quotes from Elon Musk is that ultimately it's the pace of innovation that determines competitiveness. And that's not just in product. And I might say that a little differently. It's the pace of problem solving, right? It's the pace at which you identify and solve new and interesting problems. They can be customer problems, operational problems, legal issues, whatever they are. But that is really what drives, what turns a static business into a dynamic business. And yet, that sense of constant innovation, constant problem solving, it is just not built in to the systems, to the thinking, to the structures of our institutions, even today. And I've tried to change that. I have a lot of advice on how to change it. And I think, frankly, often just the people who are attracted into management roles, the people who get ahead in organizations, typically who rises to the top is either probably the CFO, somebody out of finance who probably does not instinctively think this way, or it is the person who was running the core business, the legacy business, and they were a very good steward, right? They were not a builder, they were not a creator, they were a steward, and they didn't screw it up, and so finally you get the top job. So sometimes I'm in a little bit of a mean mood. I will say that most of those people at the top, they have a left brain the size of a watermelon and a right brain the size of a walnut, right? So that's why kind of rebalancing this institutionally is super, super difficult. And some of my peers, some management thinkers have said the way you solve this is you need to have this ambidextrous organization. You need to be able to isolate and have the innovation stuff over here and have the people who are running the core over here and so on. I just like, I don't think that's the case. I think you got to have innovation everywhere all the time at different scale and different ways. But the idea that you can just bifurcate this and I just think is wrong. I just think you can't have any part of the organization that is not constantly innovating.
I often wondered about that. So the Clayton Christensen model of you can't have the innovation team on site because it will always be drowned by the sucking sound of the core was the term. And then Tushman O'Reilly is the whole idea of that you have to have them together. So the one is within the other. And I wondered often, was one more fit for a time where things were quieter or things were more stable, where you had more of a competitive advantage and you could have that team over there? And it's changed because the cycles of change have become so much more frequent that you don't have time to actually rest on your competitive advantage anymore. I wondered, was it a historical thing and times have changed? And to your point now, the cycles of change are so fast that therefore the management types of people and management need to change or leadership inside companies.
I think that's part of it. I think that just the velocity is so much higher. But I think those who, and I think it's most management thinkers, those who have this view that you isolate and protect and ring fence innovation, like they were halfway right in the sense that any new innovation team needs to have a budget. You need some different metrics to measure it, and it needs some time and so on. So, you do measure and a breakthrough innovation project, you manage it in a different way than you manage just like an ongoing operation. That's clear. But I think that idea that you have to separate, put in an incubator, an accelerator, something else came more from a pessimism that we're just going to give up on the ability of most people and most of the organization to innovate. And so you can't expect them to do it. And in fact, what you can't expect them to do is to try to kill this thing or not support it. So let's put it somewhere. I might have mentioned this before. We did a lot of research on corporate incubators, accelerators. Almost none of them made any difference. Literally, almost none of them. I think Walmart shut its incubator down sometime last year, maybe 2023, whatever it was. But because they end up with the worst of both worlds, they are too far from the core and the people who hold the customer relationships, the resources, the technology. They're too separate from that to leverage all those strengths. So you don't really have the advantage of this big company with all these assets and resources that you should have. And on the other hand, they still have too much control from the center and too much old thinking to truly be entrepreneurial. So you end up with kind of a Frankenstein that just doesn't work. So I think that, yes, if you're trying to build an entirely new business in a company, that's going to be managed very separately. But even there, let me add another piece that I think is super important, Aiden. One of the reasons I think a lot of times new business ideas don't get off the ground or don't succeed in large organizations is because the incentive or the energy to do that new thing is not shared by the entire top team. So it's like, okay, Aiden's going to go build this new thing. Good luck to Aiden. We don't really give a crap whether you succeed or not, right? And maybe if we're competing, we're happy if you like screw it up. But like that's Aiden things to go get us into that new market, go do this. Nobody else cares. Which means that when you run into a hurdle or you need some resources or some help, like nobody's like raising their hand and saying, "Hey, Aiden, I can see like let me step in." So one of the things that I think is like super, super important and needs to be the like deep conversation and dialogue and work, significant work of the top team is I need to be able to ask any of the top 6, 8, 10, 20 leaders in an organization. What are the 5 or 6 or 7 most important opportunities for our business or our organization? And I need to get an absolute consensus on this. And they need to be able to rank order those and tell me which have the biggest upside, are going to make the biggest difference, and so on. And then what I need is cabinet responsibility. So if I know this is a top 3 priority and Aiden comes to me and says, "Hey, you know what? Can I borrow some engineering talent or can you run an experiment with your customers?" I got to say, "Yes, Aiden." That's not the way it works. And so we take the organization's resources and we divvy them up and we say like, "Aiden, you have your little team and you have your money. Don't bother the rest of us." That's like a disaster for trying to build a new thing.
And so many innovators, I'm sure you've worked with them. Those people, I took a role like this, and there's a little bit of selective hearing that you don't, or selective vision, even to go, I don't want to know that all the signals for me are that this won't work, that they're not serious about it, that it's innovation theater. And you take the role because you're so excited to have a role in innovation and to actually go for it. But without that air cover or that access to senior talent that's actually going to help you, you just drown. And you may have a couple of people interested, and they're interested from a distance as long as you're successful. But as soon as there's a sniff of this not going well, they pull out, and you're so surprised by that. Many innovators, this has happened to them. They're going, where are you guys?"
The real commitment you need is not so much financial, but it's intellectual. People have to believe and emotional. They have to believe like this is really cool. This is amazing. This is important. We cannot fail here, right? So if you don't have a shared strategic imperative around whatever that new thing is, they just look at it as a diversion of resources. And like when this fails, like good, we'll claw back some of these smart people and clever people. So yeah, and again, in most institutions, there's not a process of collectively at the top because everybody has their little role. You're running business A, B, C, division, whatever. You're responsible for, Mid East Africa. You're responsible for that, whatever. Like there's not a collective sense of where we're trying to go as a company. And if so, you will not have deep and enduring commitment to anything.
Those people, they'll know what I'm talking about here. The senior exec does support them. Then that senior exec maybe themselves get frustrated or headhunted elsewhere. And as soon as they go, all this house of cards comes tumbling down. All those people they supported are lost and eventually leave or retire on the job in frustration.
You're absolutely right, Aiden. I've seen that again and again and again. And I get it. I mean, a lot of CEOs, I mean, particularly quite progressive ones, They do not want to take the time to bring the rest of their team along. It's just like, in fact, they'll tell me sometimes, yeah, these people are all stuck in the mud. I've been fighting them for years. Like, let's just go do this, Gary. I'm going to give you a budget and this team, like, go do it. And I know that the moment that person leaves, that thing is going to be blown up because nobody else cares. So you got to take the time to build that consensus and make it real. And I sit in all these meetings with quite senior people, and you'll see their subordinates sitting around the table all like nodding, yeah, that's a great idea, boss. You know that they're not sincere, right? They're buying career insurance by just agreeing, but that's a missed opportunity. You got to go one by one and go deep and like, why are we doing this? And like, if you have objections or don't think it's going to work, let's get those all on the table. And if you don't have that consensus, yeah, all you have to do is move one person and the thing collapses.
One last piece, and I promise we'll get back to the chapter now. And just a reminder, Gary and I have been recording. By the time we release this, it'll be a year. So there's going to be stuff we repeat. We both forgot. I may have said this before, but Gary, the importance of rewards. I had Steve Kerr on the show recently, and he wrote that famous article on the folly of expecting A while rewarding B. The whole idea that you want this, but all the rewards systems in the organization are for stability, reliance, efficiency, all the things that are anti-innovation in many, many ways.
I don't know very many large companies where you have to succeed at building something new to get ahead. I think that would be quite rare. I think if you manage to do it, it is definitely a career plus, right? I mean, they're going to say, yeah, like that person built this new business, like that's fantastic. So it's definitely you get recognized for doing it, but I don't think it's an expectation. And as I say, most organizations don't have any serious set of innovation metrics. For example, one of the most basic things I think is important to do is to know what percentage of my total OPEX, my operating expenses, or my CAPEX, my investment, what percentage of that is being devoted to projects that meet the test of being truly innovative. And I would argue year by year, you want that percentage to go up. Now, recognizing that innovation does not mean that's something outside the core. It's something, that's going to cannibalize. It can be all inside the core, but it means it's not linear. And the only kind of innovation that will produce an outsized return is something that is new and not extrapolative. And so if you don't even know how much of your resources are behind those ideas, and for sure, your ability to regenerate, build an organization that will last in the future is 100% dependent on how much you're investing in those new things. So simple metrics like that do not exist in most organizations. Metrics around the quality of the innovation pipeline. Now, you may have something, you have a product development pipeline, you can look at that and how many things, but more broadly across the organization, how many ideas are we pursuing, of what quality, how fast are they coming to fruition, how much executive time is going there to support them. That doesn't happen. I would suggest that in most organizations, whatever the dozen or couple of dozen best ideas at any time that have the highest upside, the highest growth potential, those ideas should be getting attention from the executive committee once a month. Not meddling, but like, are we still putting resources? Because here's what I see often happen. You'll have a really great idea 2 or 3 levels down in an organization, and in some kind of budget crunch or quarterly pressure, whatever, some manager 3 levels down is going to pull the people out of that project or shut it down or whatever. Then somebody like 4 years later says, hey, I thought we were working on that thing. How the hell did we miss that? Well, somebody could pull the plug on it and no alarm bells went off because nobody at the top was managing a portfolio, had visibility to a portfolio of ideas, and they're accountable for the health of those things and making sure they don't get killed off for short-term benefits. So rare organizations that have that. Although we've done that in one large organization, which I won't mention the name, we put those metrics in place. We could track across every division, every product line, how much money was going into new things. And we actually set an internal target where for every division, we wanted 30% of their CapEx every year to be devoted to projects that met these tests of being innovative or not. And we did that because if we left divisional executives to their own devices, they would still opt for more of the same, just because it's easier. I don't have to stretch my thinking and so on. And so we said, listen, here's what's going to happen. If at least 30% of what you're investing in doesn't meet this test, we're going to take your investment away. Because there's often an assumption of if I'm running one of the big businesses or divisions in a company, the assumption is I'm going to get what I got last year every year, no matter like plus or minus 3%. We said, no, 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 no. You have no automatic right to capital. There's not like some path dependency where you just get more every year because like you're no, we will take it away because guess what? If we're not investing in the new, the investors will take our resources away ultimately. They'll give it to somebody else. So there are ways of putting those metrics in place, of giving them teeth, of holding people accountable, but it doesn't happen much. I think we talked last time about Procter and Gamble, and you go like, here's this great company, world leader in home care products and so on, and yet they haven't invented a new brand in like what, 20 years or something, a new billion-dollar brand? Like, what the hell are you doing with all these resources, all this knowledge, all this customer data that somehow all these creative people, and I suspect that it's just like the leadership is really not holding themselves accountable on that metric, holding everybody else accountable and paying attention to what's new and getting investment behind it.
And it must be so frustrating for the innovators. Like you join a company like that with massive budgets, with great success, great legacy for innovation, and then you're just so disappointed. And it leads me to this one because last one on this off-piste stuff is you're interested in innovation or you've worked in innovation before, new role comes up, you're going to go in this company. I'm going to go out of this company because the company I was in wasn't real about innovation. It was all theater. I'm going to go to this company. But then you have to actually conduct the interview yourself. You're interviewing them to see if they're real about it. And I wondered, had you any suggestions for people who are going through that and maybe some questions they need to know to realize it's real? Whether then they make the decision or not to join is up to them because sometimes you need the money, you need revenue coming in for yourself. But at least to do the triage test to see if they're real.
Well, I think, we've hinted at some of those things, how much investment is going in? Do they have any track record of bringing truly new products or businesses to market? How long has it been since they've done that? Do any of the people at the top have any track record of doing this, or are they all, managing the status quo? I have these 3 questions which we may have covered, but I'll say it again, my test, because I often, CEOs will often tell me like, "Hey, we're really serious about innovation." I go like, "Well, that's interesting. Let me test that." So you go down and you ask frontline employees, "Have you been trained to think like a business innovator?" "No." "All right." Number 2, is it relatively easy for you to get maybe 30% of your time and a few $1,000s to experiment? Would you know how to get that resources? Is a process for doing that without too many permissions and whatever? I wouldn't even know where to begin. And finally, is it like clear to you that your manager is accountable for all of this? Like the metrics they talk about it, does it influence their compensation? I don't think so. So I have to go back to like CEO or whatever, say, okay, you told me you're serious about this, but you don't train people, you don't make it easy, and you don't hold leaders accountable. Like clearly a different definition of seriousness than the one I have. So I mean, those are the kind of things you got to ask, when you're trying to go into a company. But I think it's a constant battle. And, it's why, many people who start companies, they've left a big company. And they just like it's just like too hard. There's no pathway to do this. Hire as a counter example, which I'm, quite familiar with the Chinese appliance maker, although much more now than an appliance company. Their goal is if you want to create a business, we're the right place to come and work. I'll give an example. They have a young guy who created a business called Thunder Robot, and they make high-end gaming PCs. Now, Hire had no business in PCs, right? They're an appliance maker. By the way, it's now a publicly listed company. It's on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. It's worth quite a lot of money, and I think it's number one in China. Hire's view is like anybody could start a business, and we're going to help you do that, and we'll take a share in it. And rather than them deciding whether to invest or not, because they'll say, like, how the hell do we know? Like, we're a bunch of old guys that grew up in the apply. How would we know how much to invest here? So instead, they will take that young business and they have a network of venture capital partners and they'll run it around that network. And if one of the venture capital partners says, yeah, this is really interesting, we'll invest, then Hire will co-invest with an option to buy out if they want to at some future date. And that's just an expectation. Of course, they're going to create new businesses and we want to participate, but we're not necessarily smart enough to decide whether to invest or not. And they have a whole ecosystem that now supports that. In fact, they think of the company as a platform for entrepreneurship. And that not only should you never have to leave to start a new business, we want to be a place where people can look at our companies, our capabilities, our distribution across China and whatever and say, I want to come build a business with you guys. And they have all the online platforms for people to submit ideas and all the review processes and so on. So, again, there is nothing, it's embarrassing because there's nothing that complicated about doing this, right? But very few companies have said, like, how do I build a company that it is just as easy as it can be for somebody to build something new?
It's really sad, isn't it? Like I feel so sorry for people who are creatively minded. There's not very many places to go to express your creativity, and then you have to find ways in your own private life to do it.
And everybody does find those ways in their private lives, right? Everybody has some creative outlet. And I think one of the problems has been, I think, that because this should be a matter of public policy. This is how do we ensure our large companies are as innovative as they can be? These companies have huge amount of resources, capital, talent, and so on. If they're not innovating, all of society suffers. And instead, I remember having this conversation some years ago with an economics minister from, I think it was the Netherlands, it might have been a Nordic country, visiting me in Silicon Valley saying, like, we want to create more entrepreneurship in our country. So that's a fantastic idea. You need to do that and make it easier. But I said, that's not going to solve the problem. If you look at I remember the big, we went through the big list of companies in this country. They'd all been laying off people and they've been missing a lot of opportunities. And it's interesting now, if you look right now, and I may have said this before, but if you look right now in the EU, including Switzerland and Britain, and you take all of the unicorns, all of the venture funded companies worth nominally $1 billion. All of those unicorns together are worth about 1.5% of the 350 largest companies in Europe. They are trivial. In fact, I wrote a piece a few years ago, and it was definitely tongue in cheek, but it was called Silicon Valley Doesn't Matter. Because, yeah, every once in a while, you get an Apple or a Facebook or an Amazon. By the way, where are the Apples, Facebooks, and Amazon in the last 10 years? Like, maybe Palantir, I don't know, but it's not like Silicon Valley is continuing to produce all these amazing companies. They are not. And that's a different subject. But I said, we cannot depend on startups to create innovation and to create a resilient economy and to create new jobs and whatever. And so this problem of the failure of large companies to innovate is a public policy issue. It's not just an issue for individual companies. And if you have a big company that lays off, let's say Volkswagen or whatever, that's laying off tens of thousands of employees, how many startups do you have to create to absorb that? And again, given kind of the attrition of startups where I'm going to create 100 and I might get 10 that survive and get one that becomes serious, I got to create this huge number. When a large company fails, there's almost no number of startups that's going to pick up that slack.
I was telling you about the reinvention summit we're having, and we have a panel called Reinventing Ireland because I believe we're in a very dangerous place because we're relying on successes we've had in the past, just like a successful business. And we don't have, like you talk about, and what this chapter is actually about is a portfolio of not businesses, but business models within a business, like Hire. So if one of those gets under threat or gets shut down, or the user of your product just moves and doesn't want it anymore, or it becomes unfashionable, you have another business model to rely on as a result of that. And I think countries are the same. I was thinking recently about the consulting firms and how they have so much outsourced to places like India. And then people in India have a whole, again, this house of cards under the structure of those people who are earning money. If they're working in these BPOs, that they then have chauffeurs to work or they're relying on the gig economy to bring them to work. There's so many people relying underneath the structure that if the top of the structure disappears, there's chaos. And therefore, it is incumbent on so many governments to actually drive this and drive the regeneration of existing businesses and not just startups.
Yeah, do you wonder if there's just behind this? I'm now riffing, so this can be ignored. But if there's just a laziness or a decadence behind it, like, I've made it, I'm all right, Jack. I'm going to feather my nest and protect my whatever. And there isn't this sense of paying forward, building forward, creating the opportunities that for the next generation. And I see this happening, within my own state of California here in the United States, where we're running huge deficits. We have the best paid public sector employees in the country, failing schools, failing infrastructure, these terrible fires. Now, this will date our podcast, but the terrible fires that have gone through Los Angeles recently. More than 10 years ago, funds were approved to build a variety of new $7.5 billion to build new reservoirs in the state of California to help provide the water and so on for these kinds of emergencies. And they've been stuck for 10 years in environmental review. Whose ass is on the line for actually caring about the future? And I think you see this in government as well, a kind of creeping decadence. We've been writing something about reforming government in a kind of fundamental way, not just making it smaller, but just making it way better. And you go back to the 1960s in my country, NASA put the first American in the moon 30 months after the agency had been founded. In the next 2 years, they put 5 more people into space. The total cost of that for NASA was $4 billion. The current big NASA rocket system, the Space Launch System, is 6 years behind schedule. Every mission will cost $4 billion, right? That was the entire Mercury space program in the 60s. Every mission will cost $6 billion. I think there's so far about $90 billion of funding into the thing. And of course, it may get shut down and SpaceX has completely passed and all this. But you go like, how the hell do you end up in an organization that is so insensitive to waste, that is so unnecessarily patient with itself, that is so afraid to experiment? And again, that just gets repeated across every public sector everywhere. I'm sure you'd have your own examples from Ireland. I can give you, I look at the NHS, which is just a money pit without any real consistent improvements in quality of care and whatever. And there's deep structural reform that is necessary in these institutions. And we'll get into that in a future conversation, I'm sure. But to come back to our conversation, it does require this willingness to look at every aspect of how we're delivering healthcare or how we're delivering telecommunication services or how we're delivering energy or whatever it is. And I look at Germany, who allowed themselves to become so dependent on a hostile power, on Russia for energy, and also to become so dependent on China as an export market. Again, a geopolitical challenger, if not an enemy. And where is the leadership in those environments? Where is the like, yeah, this is the easy way forward, but maybe not the best, and we're creating lots of vulnerabilities. Yeah. So I guess I would just call it decadence. I don't know what's another word to use.
JFK wrote a book called Profiles in Courage about people in politics who made unsavory decisions and actually paid the price. I mean, ultimately, it comes back to that rewards thing is like, it doesn't always end well for the whistleblower or the person who actually makes the tough decision to actually choose to go, you know what, I'm going to spend taxpayer money on this and it's not going to pay off today. I was thinking that when you were saying we had a lady, Michelle Walker, who wrote a wonderful book called The Grey Rhino. She's been on the show a couple of times and she talked about the fact that, say, New Orleans and places that had drastic floods, that same thing as California. There was funds attributed to building preventative measures and not activated, or they were used for something else. Yeah, siphoned off, and I'm bringing it back to innovation because there's a famous video of Obama talking about the risk of something like a Spanish flu coming back 10 years before COVID came out and saying we need to invest in measures to what to do if something like this happens. But I thought about that from an innovation perspective and go, I've seen this where you have metrics brought into the company to go, we need to be more innovative. And then, say, for example, you're trying to generate a new digital revenue. I saw this, I worked in the media industry, and the traditional analog media guys used to just siphon off and go, yeah, 10% was digital. And you're kind of going, but where is it? What did you sell? Because I was naive. I was like, show me what it is because I want to learn from you. And there was nothing there. It was just allocate 10% towards this new revenue fund. And you see that time and time again where it's not real. But to your point, somebody needs to be going and scrutinizing this to make sure it is.
Well, it's interesting. We've had all this debate over the last few years about, a company needs a purpose. Well, yes, of course it needs a purpose. And that's hardly a new thought. I mean, great companies back through history had a purpose. Henry Ford wanted to bring mobility to millions and millions of people. That was as wonderful a purpose as you can probably have. IBM saw the power of digital technology to make companies run better and so on and so on. So yeah, purpose is good, but what I really need, you can edit this out. I need people with balls all the way down, right? Male or female, people who have the guts to who are not only in it for their career, who are not only in it for themselves, because as you say, all of these things take some courage to stand up, to challenge the status quo, to put aside some resources for something that is somewhat uncertain. And you, in the end, and again, we'll talk about the systemic angle on this and how our systems don't support those kinds of people very well. But at the end, blaming the system is a little bit of a cop out, right? Like you either stand up and you're counted and you take the slings and arrows and you say, hey, this is important, or you don't. And I think that so I would worry more about what's my own tolerance to challenge people and to be maybe a little unpopular and so on versus, yeah, we need some higher order purpose and some form of words and so on. Yeah, fine. But what it really comes down to is your guts to be a change maker and to take on the system. And it's interesting. Again, we may get to this later, but you said John Kennedy's book Profiles in Courage. If you go back and you look at the people who really changed the world, almost none of them had a lot of formal power. Right? They didn't. They were activists, right? They weren't CEOs, they weren't prime ministers, they weren't. Now here and there you get somebody who really was, but mostly they weren't. And all these CEOs telling me, hey, we need to change faster. And I go, have you taught any of your people how to be activists? Right? How to build a coalition, how to try new things, how to identify points of influence, how to enroll other people. Like, no, we haven't, like, they haven't even thought about that. And yet, if I'm a CEO, those are the people I most want in my company, right? Because they're my insurance against the unknown. They're my insurance against complacency. They're my insurance against arrogance. And if I don't have people in my organization who can do that, and who can do that and not get fired or not get immediately marginalized, we're screwed.
I'm going to show on the screen one of the diagrams from the book because this chapter 3, if you as a senior leadership team or any level in the organization want to challenge your business concept blind spots that prevent you from seeing opportunity for innovation, this chapter gives you all the questions to ask yourself, give you examples, etc. And there's one key piece. So if you listen to us or you're watching us now, have a look at what I'm going to share on the screen. And Gary, I'd love you to talk us through this one because this kind of gives you an overview of the boxes that you can then work from. So this is the concept of putting your business model concept or your business model generation together, as Gary called it, business concept innovation.
It's pretty straightforward in a sense. It's, how do you reach the customer? What's the value proposition? What's the product bundle, the service bundle? What is the marketing message around all of that? What does it feel like to be a customer? How do they learn about you? How do they acquire a product? How do they use it? How do they deal with whatever issues come up? The core strategy is what are the fundamental choices you made about, what's in and out of that product bundle, about, the price for it, about which customers you're going to go after. So all the kind of core elements of product market choice that you'd expect there. Where are you creating competitive advantage? What are the differentiated capabilities that you're trying to build? Then finally, okay, behind that strategy and the customer interface, what are the skills, assets, resources you actually have? What deep talent do you have? What core competencies do you have? What assets do you have in terms of factories, distribution channels, and so on? But what are all the resources that come together to make that possible? Which do you need to control? Which are you happy to outsource? And then finally, the value network is like, what other players are part of this? Do you have a developer network? Are you part of on another platform, like somebody selling on Etsy or Shopify or so on? So just looking at every one of these, and I think in the chapter we break these down into a lot more detail. It's tedious actually to go through that chapter. It's really important. Like, so it's worth the price of the book, I would tell you, but I think it's still tedious because you just got to go through every one and think about it and ask yourself, like, are there other choices? Is there a better way to do this? But yeah, I think those are the four components. And I think if I remember, there was a kind of a fifth one that we added on, which is really, is there something here that will drive superior profitability as well? So are there lock-in effects or network effects or first mover effects that really turbocharge the whole business model in a way?
There was a couple of terms. One of them was company boundaries. And I'll tee you up here with a little quote here to remind you of what you wrote. Intermediating between a company's strategic resources and its value network are the firm's boundaries. This bridge component refers to the decisions that have been made about what the firm does and what it contracts out to the value network. Again, an important aspect of any business model is the choice of what the firm will do for itself and what it will outsource to suppliers, partners, or coalition members. Changing these boundaries is often an important contributor to business model innovation. An example then you give is the PCs industry's spectacular growth, driven by innovative boundary decisions by IBM, Microsoft, and Intel. Some of those businesses have since fallen on tough times, but maybe you'll expand on this because I thought this was a really key one that wasn't as understandable unless you really got your head into this chapter.
Yeah, obviously you can concentrate your resources, focus your resources, grow faster, do more if you have a great set of partners around you, if you're leveraging other assets, resources, channels that are already there. So you want to be very, very creative in thinking about how do you leverage existing ecosystems and infrastructure and so on. At the same time, you want to be super careful that you don't inadvertently give away, outsource, offshore, whatever, something that is fundamental to long-term competitive success. And I think a lot of companies and a lot of CEOs have, under short-term financial pressure, said, let me give that away. A class example we might have talked about, I think before, and I can't remember, is when Boeing made this decision to spin out the manufacturing of fuselage, aircraft fuselage. They did that because it's quite capital intensive. And like, if we get rid of that, like our return on assets probably goes up, right? That's a little profitability boost there. But you outsource it and you hire people who are not deeply experienced in doing this, like that's probably a bad decision, right? This is something that's integral to the quality, the safety, and so on of an aircraft and its performance. So there's a tension here of how do I leverage external resources, and it tends to work like a ratchet, right? Now, Boeing is actually, I think, bringing that back inside. If I am right on that, but there's a tension, be a ratchet, because once you've put something outside and you are no longer building those competencies, hiring people, paying attention to that, you probably never regain whatever that went. It's going to be really quite difficult to reintegrate it. So you want to be quite careful about making those choices because, in a practical sense, they're often irreversible. The other thing I would say is, so understand what is really important to creating customer value, what is important to creating competitive differentiation, and be very, very careful about putting those outside the boundaries of the firm. Now, obviously, there's all kind of complexity to this. If you look at Apple's iOS ecosystem, yes, all those developers are outside of Apple physically, but they are very deeply integrated into the ecosystem with the tools and the support and so on. And it would be very, very hard for anybody else to replicate. I mean, Google has their version of that, but beyond those two companies, very hard for somebody to replicate that from scratch. So it's not that every decision to rely on partners, outsource, presents strategic risk. It doesn't. Often it's a huge opportunity, but you want to be super, super thoughtful about that. And one place, and this is just me, and I'll let other people argue, but one of the places I think that we've often got this wrong is companies outsourcing customer contact. I bank with one of the big British banks as well as banks in the United States, but every time, and I've been a customer, and I think a fairly profitable customer for 40 years. And every time I want to talk to somebody, I'm talking to somebody on the other side of the world who I frankly have a hard time understanding at some points. Uh, I'm sorry I don't speak every language and understand every dialect around the world, but I don't. And they don't know me, and they have almost no discretionary ability to do anything. So everything is like a series of handoffs and whatever. And you go like, okay, somebody made that decision because to put it there and with perhaps undertrained people, no discretion, because it's going to save them, let me say, maybe 1 pound in interaction, whatever. And so they are costing me my time and my frustration to save themselves a little bit of money. And you see this in every day when you end up spending hours. We're experiencing unusually heavy call volume. Bullshit. You're understaffed and you always have been. And you've decided that you can waste the time of somebody who's maybe making 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 pounds an hour to save the time of somebody who's making 10 pounds an hour, right? You made that calculation. So I think that is one place where you see a lot of kind of, I guess, what we call penny wise, pound foolish. So it's just something that you have to be very strategic and very thoughtful about it and be very careful if when a vendor or a consultant or somebody else comes to you, their primary argument is just an economic one, a short-term economic one. Be super suspicious about that argument and think a lot deeper about it.
I always think of that the map is not the territory. So a consultant coming in doesn't know your business. It doesn't really know your business and is coming in. And just like the original maps were just drawn out and gone, there's a lake or an ocean there. Let's cut it and make that into a new country that side. The decisions are made out of context of actually what it's really. But I thought we'd share because you mentioned these profit boosters, and you group these into four categories, and I think these are so important, particularly for bringing it back to what we talked about earlier on. If you're going to have an experiment, and sometimes it's the execution of the experiment builds a capability for you, and this can create what you talked about learning effects or increasing returns. So, this is the first of the four categories. The second then is competitor lockout, strategic economies, and then you have a whole book on that one, strategic flexibility as well.
So the first one was, learning or network effects. You know, there are a lot of industries where with every customer interaction or with every unit of manufacturing, you acquire information, you get better, and that produces increasing returns to scale. And that's particularly true with networks. So if I want to sell something online, there's really only a couple of places to do that. I'm going to go to eBay or Etsy or something else because I want to go to where everybody else is selling, right? Or Airbnb would be a classic example of that, right? It's a platform. And if I want to have a property, I want to invite the guests and so on, that's where you go. And that's why often you will see startups early on invest hugely, take huge losses to try to accelerate the acquisition of customers, of information, of network effects, and then the rate at which they can improve the offering. So if you get in front of that thing and you build out first, that's why so many of these digital businesses end up being monopolies. Simply, you got so many customers so quickly, and there's only going to be one or two networks, right? There's only going to be one or two mobile phone operating systems. There's only going to be one or two like truly massive online sales platforms. There'll be a lot of smaller ones around the fringes. There's only going to be a handful of social networks, right? And that doesn't mean new ones won't emerge. They will, but there's huge benefits of being first there.
I'd love to just expand on that one.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I think I think we talked about this already, but we were talking about it's the same with VHS versus Betamax. There's a big winner, and there's almost a formula to this, to partnerships and working with developers and stuff like that for gaming consoles, for example. But I wanted to call out this cautionary piece that you say that first mover advantages are never absolute, but they are often pivotal in industries with a rapid pace of technological development and relatively short product life cycles. If you get in late, you tell us you're going to be fighting the US Marines with slingshots and bottle rockets. Preemption requires a great product, a capacity to learn fast, and a willingness to double up your bets. Being first means nothing if you're trying to sell something nobody wants or if it takes forever to respond to customer input. Apple may have been first with handheld computers, but the Newton was so woefully underdeveloped that it left the door wide open for Palm Pilot. I thought that was important. It's kind of like almost a recent enough example was Google Maps had this head start, and then Apple tried to launch the map, did a terrible job of it, and now I don't think if anybody ever goes back and uses Apple Maps because of that first experience again. So I thought that was an important piece just to share before we go on to
Yeah, and you have to remember that before Google Maps, there was MapQuest, right? There were other services there as well. So yeah, scale is hugely important. But I think one of the thoughts buried in there is it's not very helpful to talk about first mover and second mover. I prefer to talk about smart mover and dumb mover. So I do think there's an advantage often to being first. And I think in general, it's better to be first than not. But as you say, to be first, you first of all have to make sure that you're learning very fast, that you are testing every assumption as you go, that you can pivot very quickly. Because to be first and stupid, you just open the door for somebody else. And in fact, Apple was not first into mobile phones. They were not first into portable music players. They were mostly first into tablets, I would say. So there's often the chance to learn from a stupid mover and then come back and do something better. And kind of Apple's try to do that. They weren't first with VR devices, and we'll see if Vision Pro survives. Well, it's not going to survive in its current form. We know that, but we'll see what happens with that. One failure mode is just to be too slow and leave the door open to something moving faster. But another failure mode is to move too fast and to get your investments in front of your actual understanding of what's going on. And then you end up putting your investments in the wrong places. Velocity is fundamental. Every venture capitalist will tell you that, but you got to do it in a smart way. And look at the race between Uber and Lyft and so on. Classic case of no driver is going to sign up for 5 services. No customer is going to have 5 apps on their phone for ride sharing. So whoever builds out that network and does it first. But that doesn't mean at the end of the day, you still have a viable business model, right? You may be subsidizing years later because it's just too expensive and the model doesn't work. But man, faster is always better than slower as a general rule. The benchmark on speed just goes up and up and up. I think it took Facebook 4 or 5 years to get the first 100 million customers. I think TikTok did that in under a year. Chat GPT did it in 60 days, right? So you have these ecosystems there. The amplification effects of social media are so powerful when something starts to work. Today, like you just have to have the pedal down all the time.
and back to your point about you therefore can't have the innovation guys and girls over there. Like you need to have that muscle in the company to survive this rate of change. The next one was, and we'll talk about these briefly, was competitive lockout or choke points. And a little reminder here. So I'd never heard about this before, and I thought it was a really interesting one to share because Intel, for many of us, thought were untouchable for a long, long time after they'd kind of regenerated the Andy Grove time. So to jump to this new smaller conductor, etc. But you said only Intel has anything close to Microsoft's lock on customers. I think Microsoft is fair enough to say still has that lock. A few years ago, Intel's co-founder, and this was at the writing of the book, co-founder Gordon Moore, Moore's Law Gordon, was asked whether he had been worried about his company's x86 chip architecture and how it would be supplanted by new technologies such as RISC, reduced instructor set computing. His answer was a telling no. We had this tremendous advantage, he said. All of the software that people had bought that ran on our instruction set. And you went on to say Intel may be paranoid, only the paranoid survived, about many things, but a new chip architecture that would knock it out of PCs is probably not one of them. So even these companies that had the lock in, it doesn't mean anything in this day and age with the rate of change.
Yeah, I mean, no lock-in is forever. And, some of the tech companies who are under, you know, pressure from antitrust competition authorities will tell you that. Like there is, I mean, you know, Facebook, uh, they bought Instagram and like that was a smart thing because the average user on Facebook, kids are not using it anymore. I think on that kind of critical young demographic, probably less than 30% of young people are on Facebook. I was with a group of Facebook employees not so long ago. I said, like, the bad news is I'm now your demographic. Like, pity you guys. Although I don't use it either. But in any case, yeah. And then came TikTok, right? So lock-in is always temporary. And again, that was an example. Like, how paranoid are you really if you're telling me you don't worry about this because everybody is locked in? And when you get a technological discontinuity that's great enough, it will dissolve that lock-in. It goes away. Or you may still have it, but nobody cares anymore because all the action is somewhere else. So lock-in is never forever, but it works very well when you have it and you have 70% gross margins and there's no place for customers to go. And you got to be careful about assuming that. But when you're fast, you have something that becomes a standard. But again, it happens very rarely. I think it's for most businesses, it's probably not very realistic to believe you're going to create that kind of competitor lockout. I think it would be hard. It's happened in other industries to a degree historically. The distribution strength of Coca-Cola and Pepsi for years meant it was difficult for other soft drinks and whatever to get shelf space. I think that's now changed, but it's good when you can get it. And always thinking about, what do I do here that locks in resources, locks in customers, and so on. I mean, in a way, the goal of strategy is to create a monopoly advantage in one way or the other. Until somebody tells you like that's illegal or you can't do it or whatever. And a lot of Michael Porter's work around competitive strategy, he was simply reverse engineering kind of antitrust policy and saying, this is what you want to aim to do, right? Build an unassailable advantage and lock customers in, lock competitors out, capture those economies of scale. And, you know, but again, as you were indicating earlier, the sheer underlying pace of change means those monopolies or that lock-in is way more fragile than, I mean, AT&T, the big US telecommunications company, enjoyed that what for maybe 70, 80 years? And the publishing industry, the newspaper industry enjoyed that for a couple hundred years because it was so expensive to run printing plants and get newspapers on every doorstep and at every little corner shop and so on. And then it's not.
And back to your point again as well, that's why there's an onus on us to actually prepare people, and I mean children, educating them, etc., for more resilience. Because if we just leave them to go with the old model of education for a staid, steady economy, that doesn't exist anymore. And I think that they need more resilience and they need to be able to fail and not feel that it's personal, because you may fail because your industry has failed.
I think that's a super good point, Aiden. And hopefully most kids figure that out today because a credential at the most, a credential allows you to open the door by an inch, right? But what people are going to care first about is not your credential, but what have you done, right? Show us your portfolio, show us the project, show us your ideas, not the credential. And then, once you're in or in any job, you are competing against everybody else to learn faster and to stay relevant. And that's a lifelong pursuit. I had to get a PhD because it's kind of a union card if you want to be in academics. But by golly, the PhD doesn't buy you anything, right? It's like, what did you write last week or last month or whatever? And most of that continuous learning is going to be your responsibility. You cannot expect your employer to do it like for you. Lucky if they do, but mostly you're going to have to be on the web learning, taking courses, improving, doing things in your spare time that increase your marketability.
To the very point of what we talked about, Gary, that you can't pick this up reading a HBR article. Even your work that I've studied it, and you have to have something to stick it to. You have to put it into practice. You have to see it in action in order for it to stick. I think we'll leave it there. The last two were strategic economies. We know them: scope and scale, and strategic flexibility. Something that we have talked about in the past, and we're going to talk about again. I absolutely love the book. We're only on chapter 3. I'm going to keep going on a couple of examples in this book. We'll try and wrap it up in a 3 part. The book again is this one, Leading the Revolution. And we've covered part 1, we covered chapter 1 and 2, and there we just covered chapter 3, a really pivotal chapter in the whole book. And as always, Gary, for people who want to find you, find out, reach out to you, looking for keynotes and maybe workshops, I know you do a lot of that work. Where is the best place to find you?
GaryHamel.com, or you can always email me at Gary@GaryHamel.com, and find me on X, Prof. Hamill. Find me on LinkedIn. Always glad to have a conversation, answer questions, and hear what other people are doing.
Always a pleasure. Author of Leading the Revolution, Gary Hamel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.